I thought we would interact a little bit with a guy who's had a big force on this series we've been in. His name is Bob. He consulted with us on this. I've gone on trips with him. I actually did a guided trip with him through Turkey and Greece. He has been educated at Princeton. He is an archaeologist. He takes people on guides all over the world. He's a biblical scholar, and I wanted to dig into some things with him today. Please welcome Bob. Bob, how are you doing today?
Doing great, Brian. Thanks for having me.
You know, you've dedicated your life to all of this stuff. Why is that?
Well, I find that when you actually go and visit the places where biblical events took place and you look at the history and the archaeology behind it, what you discover is a level of reliability and authenticity to the Bible and specifically to the gospel accounts of Jesus' life, which adds not only a depth of meaning, but also a depth of confidence in the accuracy of what we read in the Bible.
Well, you had some great stuff in this series for us to go check out. I mean, your tip on Cana and that hike that we took up to Cana was pretty epic, man. It's been very, very helpful. The whole prophecy thing. A lot of people get skittish about prophecy. It sounds really ominous, and quite frankly, I've seen some pastors and Bible teachers totally misunderstand and abuse the idea of prophecy, but yet it's important. Give us a little thumbnail sketch on it.
Yeah, in the Bible, we have revelation, which means that God is revealing things that couldn't be known through simple human means. And prophecy is often the word that God gives to people that usually it has an immediate meaning for the people that are hearing it, but it often has a deeper meaning that's going to be fulfilled later in history.
So is this evidence? I mean, is this part of the evidence we would have for God being true, Jesus being real?
Yeah, well, when you see biblical prophecy fulfilled in history, it's just another one of those elements that shows us how reliable and how true the scriptures are.
And how would you see that showing us that it's true?
Well, I think Jesus is the greatest fulfillment of all biblical prophecy. The Old Testament prophets foretold that the Messiah would be conceived by a virgin, that he would be born in Bethlehem, that he would grow up or live in Nazareth, that he would heal the sick, that he would give sight to the blind, make the lame walk, he would set prisoners free, those who are oppressed. The prophets foretold that the Messiah would ultimately appear on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem, that he would enter riding a donkey, that he would ultimately, from Isaiah and the suffering servant, that he would be rejected by the leaders of Israel, that he would be beaten, that he would be killed ultimately. And Jesus himself prophesies his own death and specifically his resurrection. And so when you look at, and there's hundreds of other prophecies as well, I've just touched on a few. And when you see how Jesus is the fulfillment of these prophecies, it's another piece of evidence that points us to he's not a myth, it's not a story someone made up. He is who he claimed to be, and that has huge significance for us today.
So for the person who doubts, or for the person who has doubts, I mean, all of us have doubts from time to time, just one final shot. What would you say to us to help us grapple with that topic?
Yeah, I mean, doubt is not a bad thing. Doubt is not the opposite of faith. You know, when my boys were young, I taught them that fear was not the opposite of bravery, that bravery is choosing to do something even when you feel afraid. And that's how doubt works. Doubt is being honest. You know, the truth is there are claims in the Bible, there's claims about Jesus that we can't fully verify just through human methods of history and archaeology and all those other things. And so there's a point at which we have to take a step of faith. And faith is not the opposite of doubt. Faith is the decision to act and to trust God in that action, even when we have doubts. And so to the person who has doubts, I would say, look at the historical record, look at the archaeological record, look at the textual record, see how reliable the accounts of Jesus' life are, that these were eyewitnesses who recorded these things. These were people that ultimately died, most of them, for their testimony to the fact that it was true. But in the end, you have to take that step of faith. And I believe it's when you're listening to God, as Paul says in Romans 10, that's how faith is formed in our hearts. So if you have doubts, for sure, look at all the evidence that we have. But in the end, it's up to you. You have to decide, am I going to trust Jesus? Am I going to take a step of faith to put my life into his hands?
So, Bob, what do people most misunderstand in relationship to who Jesus was?
I think there's two opposite mistakes that most people make. The first is that they just assume Jesus was a great teacher, he was a great humanitarian, he was just someone to admire. And as you've pointed out earlier in the series, that's not really a viable option that Jesus has left us with, because he himself consistently claimed to be the divine Son of God, the Messiah who came to save the whole world. And in making that claim, Jesus can't just be a good man, because otherwise he'd be lying or he'd be delusional, which means he's not a good man. And so Jesus himself points us to the fact that he's more than just a man. He is God who became fully human, entered into our world to reveal himself and ultimately to save us. I think the other mistake that people make is they go the opposite direction. When they do embrace the divinity of Jesus, they overlook his full humanity. And they just think Jesus did all the things he did because he was divine. But the Bible's very clear that God emptied himself and became fully human in the person of Jesus for those 33 or so years on earth. And the significance of that is huge, because what it means is that then Jesus' life, everything he did, becomes an example, a model for us to follow. He lived the life that we were meant to live. And because we have the Holy Spirit living inside of us, it's actually possible for us to live a Jesus-shaped kind of life like that. So I think we want to avoid those two mistakes when we look at Jesus.
Is there any evidence that we have that God actually keeps his promises?
Yeah, I mean, the biblical record is filled with prophecies and promises that God makes in the past about the future. And when we look at the Bible, we look at those Old Testament prophecies and promises, we can see again and again and again how God is true to his word, how God fulfills those promises. And I think, the most powerful example of that is Jesus himself.
Hmm.
Jesus
And that's always the
fulfills.
answer, isn't it? Jesus. That's
Yeah,
always the answer.
Jesus, exactly. It looks like a squirrel, it's Jesus. But it's true, because from his birth to his death, we see Jesus fulfilling the prophecies and the promises of God. And Jesus fulfills his own prophecies and promises about himself. Most importantly, that he is going to rise from the dead. I mean, if somebody says, hey, I'm going to die and rise from the dead, and then they actually do it, well, that gives you a very, very strong basis to believe all the promises that that person has made.
Bob, it seems like a romantic occupation to be an archaeologist. It probably isn't, but as an archaeologist, is there a find that you've had or you've come across or you've read about that you said, wow, this is exactly why the science of archaeology is stimulating my faith?
Yeah, I mean, I've had that experience so many times, and I wouldn't have time to tell you all the examples, but one that pops into my mind is when I realized that Golgotha, the place of the skull where Jesus was crucified by the Romans, it's part of an ancient rock quarry, which you showed us a couple of weeks ago in this series. And when the stone cutters were cutting big blocks of stone out of that hill to rebuild the temple after the return from exile, there was one section of the limestone that was fissured, and it wasn't stable enough to use as building blocks. So they just cut around, the builders cut around that area, and they left this 20-foot high limestone rocky outcropping that must have looked kind of like a skull, and that's where they crucified people. And amazingly, Jesus said, he quoted Psalm 118, and he said that the rock, the stone that the builders rejected, has become the cornerstone. And he said that specifically days before his death, after he told them a parable about how he was going to be taken outside the city and killed. And the disciples didn't understand at the time, but later, Peter especially must have gotten it when he realized Golgotha is literally the stone that the builders rejected. That they literally
They
cut
didn't
around
want
and
it.
said,
They
no,
didn't want
this
it for
is
the
no good.
temple. Yes.
Yeah, this is no good for building. We're rejecting this stone. And it must have hit Peter because in Acts 4, when he's on trial in front of the Sanhedrin and he's giving his testimony, he says specifically that. He says, and you, the builders, he says to the religious leaders, you, the builders, rejected the stone, Jesus, that has now become the cornerstone of this whole new creation. So like when I realized that archaeologically that stone can be identified as the stone that the builders rejected, it was like another level of meaning of how Jesus was prophesying the details of his own death and resurrection.
Well, Bob, you've been so helpful in this whole series, helpful for me personally. Thank you. I'm thankful very much for you. In case you want to follow up more with Bob and hear some of his ideas, he's got a new book out called Recovering the Way. You may want to check that out if you like geeking out on Bible stuff. He's got a great one for you. Just a good man and a good friend.